Amazon workers who testified against AI data centers say they were intimidated by the leverage shift starts now. Here is the signal that separates noise from actionable change. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. Workers who publicly testified against the company's aggressive AI data center expansion say they were intimidated, monitored, and pressured after speaking out. This isn't just a workplace grievance, it's a signal about how big tech handles dissent when stakes get high. Here's what happened. Multiple Amazon employees came forward with concerns about the company's plans to build massive AI data centers, citing environmental and labor issues. But after their testimony became public, these same workers reported experiencing workplace surveillance, schedule changes, and what they describe as retaliation, a clear shift in how Amazon treats internal critics once they go public. Why this matters right now? Amazon generates roughly 15% of its revenue from AWS, their cloud division. AI infrastructure is the fastest-growing segment of AWS. The company has committed billions to building data centers specifically for AI workloads, partly because competition from Microsoft and Google is intensifying. When workers push back on this expansion, Amazon's response isn't to engage, it's to contain. That's the pattern we're seeing. The intimidation tactics reported are specific. Workers describe increased monitoring, sudden changes to their teams or locations, and what feels like deliberate isolation from colleagues who might have similar concerns. One worker noted they were pulled into meetings with HR immediately after internal posts questioning data center expansion policies. Another reports their break schedule was changed within days of their testimony becoming visible to management. Let's look at the stakes. If Amazon is retaliating against workers who speak up, two things happen. First, the company suppresses internal dissent, which means problems stay hidden until they blow up externally, regulators, lawsuits, media pressure. Second, it signals to other workers, don't speak up, or face consequences. That's how you build a culture where bad decisions don't get challenged early. But here's the contrarian angle that matters. Amazon could argue this is simply standard management response. If an employee is making claims that damage company reputation, moving them to different teams or increasing oversight is normal HR practice. The question becomes, is Amazon retaliating for protected speech, or is it reasonable business response to employees creating liability? That distinction is legally significant. What changes next? If these workers file formal retaliation complaints with the National Labor Relations Board, Amazon could face investigations. If the pattern holds across multiple employees, we're looking at potential precedent-setting labor cases. And if regulators start investigating Amazon's handling of internal critics on AI expansion, it opens the door to broader scrutiny of how tech companies manage dissent on infrastructure decisions. For workers in tech broadly, this case signals something important. Speaking up publicly has costs, even in companies that market themselves as progressive. For investors in Amazon, this raises questions about governance and risk management when core executives disagree internally. For policymakers, it's evidence that voluntary corporate self-regulation on AI infrastructure decisions isn't working. Workers don't feel safe raising concerns. The timing is also instructive. We're at a moment when every cloud provider is racing to build AI data centers faster than competitors. Speed matters more than normal operational caution. In that environment, internal voices raising safety or labor concerns become friction points. Amazon's response, monitoring, isolation, reassignment, is a way to remove that friction. Whether that's smart business or illegal retaliation depends on what else gets uncovered. What to watch over the next few weeks. Look for whether other Amazon workers come forward with similar stories that would establish a pattern. Monitor if the NLRB launches an investigation. Check whether Amazon's public statements about worker safety or labor practices change. And pay attention to how other cloud providers respond. Will they preemptively signal they handle internal dissent differently, or stay quiet? This story matters because it reveals how power works inside big tech companies that say they're building responsibly often don't have internal structures that reward responsibility over speed. Workers who believe AI infrastructure expansion should be questioned face genuine risk. And the market hasn't yet priced in the labor and regulatory costs of moving too fast without internal checks. This is worth paying attention to. Subscribe at atlassignal.in for daily intelligence on how power and incentives drive decisions in tech, markets, and policy. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.